Giovanni? Good morning. I think we're ready to start. I was the last one, not because I'm Italian, but because they were late with the technology. So good morning. I'm Roberta Bonatti. I'm very pleased to be moderating this session. We have a shorter time than expected, so we'll go straight into the discussion. And what I'd like to do is actually to set the scene. Where are we today? My panelists here were told me off when I said I'd like to get a sense of how the relationship between Europe and the US has evolved in terms of counter-terrorism, radicalization, and security over the past 18 years, 16 years since 9/11. And of course, I said it's too long, but I still would like to set the scene. And I open the question to a volunteer. Maybe I ask Matthew to volunteer. Matthew, the reason why I ask you is because you've actually seen it all. You were on the front line in different capacities just before, during 9/11. And you've continued to be involved on a technical level in this area.
I don't think that's why you've asked me. You've asked me because we've known each other a long time, and you know that I would never say no to you on anything.
I wanted to annoy you. Go ahead.
So first of all, I just want to thank EPC and the U.S. mission for putting this conference together, and it's a pleasure to be in a panel with such fantastic experts. On 9/11, I was with the FBI, and I led the analytical team for Flight 175, the second flight to hit the Trade Center. Very, very quickly, within hours, it was very clear that this was the transnational threat in its purest sense. And we had US teams flying out to Germany and the UAE and all over the world. And I think that really was a turning point in terms of the US sense of how to coordinate with allies on a threat that was truly transnational in nature. First of all, our allies stepped up in the biggest possible ways, and it was a lesson in crisis cooperation. But what grew out of that was much, much more important, this systemic cooperation. And it wasn't always without bumps. Years later, I was at the Treasury Department as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence, and we had some issues between the United States and Europe over things like the terror finance tracking program and the ability to look into data through the SWIFT bank transfer system to be able to thwart attacks not only against the United States but against Europe as well. And we made lots of trips here to Brussels to negotiate that and found a way to do that in a way that would respect privacy, not only from a U.S. perception of privacy, but a European sense of privacy. And it has taken time, but I have to say that over the years, this transatlantic cooperation on counterterrorism has been a real cornerstone. Everybody agrees terrorism is bad. Sometimes we disagree on how to define things. Are you going to treat a group like Lebanese Hezbollah the same way you're going to treat an Al-Qaeda or an Islamic State? But we've been able to work through those as well. And of course, the most recent manifestation is dealing with countering violent extremism or even preventing violent extremism. And we don't agree on everything there, but I think what's amazing is the extent to which we've been able to learn from one another. And in the United States, I think now there's a greater appreciation than there used to be, for example, of how ahead of us many European countries are in putting in place CVE programming, and how much it's not only that the United States can teach our European allies, but how much we can learn from our European allies.
I'll go next and agree with everything that Matthew just said. But before I really give him the chance to soak that in a little bit, let me thank also the EPC and our colleagues at the U.S. mission for having me here today. I think you're exactly right. When you talk about how much we've learned and how much the relationship has grown over the years, and it's telling that we were both in the Department of Justice on 9/11. Matthew, as at the FBI, I was a prosecutor at the Department of Justice. And at that time, our focus was on the investigation, the counterterrorism response. And it really wasn't until this relationship between the United States and Europe grew in terms of how we respond. And then how you respond, it's also how do you prevent? And it was this idea of prevention, I think, that was born in the relationship that we have with Europe which has led to this global movement on countering violent extremism, or CVE. So when we talk about how to combat terrorism, how to prevent terrorism, how to intervene in the life cycle of a terrorist, it's really this notion of CVE, which again bore fruit through this relationship.
Thank you. Alexandra and Alexander for the European perspective, and actually you come from a very different, interesting angle, because Alexander was a member of the Berlin Parliament at the time of the 9/11 attacks. So from your political and technical perspective, you've seen a whole evolution, and you had to work directly on this. What have you seen changing in?
Well, at the beginning, the key question was what happened and what do these guys want from us? And because most people in Europe were not focusing on Al-Qaeda or Islamist terrorism or anything that is related to it. And there was a learning curve, and this also connects to what the EU and member states are doing today, establishing mechanisms to exchange lessons learned. For example, in the Radicalisation Awareness Network, where all member states participate in exchanging practice experiences, bringing in academics, bringing in policymakers, a mechanism, and I'm sure Alexandra will say more about it, to shorten the learning curve, right? The complexity of the issues involved is obvious. Something that works in one member state might not necessarily work in another. So moving from 9/11 to today is a big movement. Also, PVE, I think, is relevant in prevention in contrast to countering, because we understand terrorism as a means of escalation, right? It is an extreme way of political communication. It is a kind of bloody political theater where you want a reaction by your enemies, and in the best case for a terrorist is an overreaction. So if we're only in this countering cycle, fighting back terrorists with violence and, strategic military or police forces, we might actually feed the beast that we're trying to limit. So preventing that from growing, the swamp or the root causes, the drivers, the grievances, the emotional needs, that's something that is somewhat newer to the discussion.
Thank you. Alexandra.
Yeah, I think I can directly relate to what Alexander said, and also to what the previous speaker said. After 9/11, the European response, which was then laid down first in the counter-terrorism strategy in 2005, was precisely to build that strategy on 4 pillars, and one of the pillars was indeed prevention. So the understanding that we can and must act with security measures, prosecute, prevent, protect. But the prevent aspect was of particular importance to really tackle the root causes of radicalization. And that is a very important strand in EU policy since 2005 and has been developed ever since. And just to come back to this broader scene setting, indeed, I think since 9/11, the cooperation has continuously grown, and I would say in a number of areas it is very much on the operational side, indeed, on information sharing. It's very much on the policy exchanges. It is also, I think, not only on a bilateral, between member states and the US, but also with the EU as a whole and its agencies. But it's also a very close relationship in international fora like the Global Coalition or our G7 or the FATF, tackling different aspects where I think a better and common understanding has been developed, and very, very close cooperation in all these different fora and all the different aspects has really grown. And I think we will probably come under different questions you may ask later on. Also that there is a mutual learning. After 9/11, you had all the data, but the data was not linked. And I think we are going kind of through the same process that at the European level, we have a lot of databases and systems on visa, on border control, on asylum, and the challenge to link and ensure this interoperability of these databases, where this is one example where indeed the lessons learned from the US are very valuable in designing also our strategies.
Thank you, Alexandra. Actually, you raise an important point, and that is the ability to read data. How do you feel, where do you feel there are most gaps, both in terms of reading and in the same understanding? Do we in Europe have the same understanding and same ability to read, or the same ability to translate data in a response as in the US? Not in qualitative, but like in terms of understanding the same language? Or do we have a different type of interpretation? And if so, where do you...
I'm not sure that we have a different understanding of how to read the data. I mean, I think it's really the major challenge is to have the access to the right data and then make proper evaluations and have proper bodies who actually can make these linkages. I mean, if you look, for example, on terrorist financing, the financial intelligence units that have precisely that task to gather the intelligence and make this evaluation of where there are hints of terrorist financing or where we can connect through financial investigations broader terrorist networks, these are precisely the agencies or bodies that should do this analysis, and there the major challenge is that they have access to the relevant data, and that is also where the Commission has come up with a number of proposals recently, so that these financial intelligence units really have access to bank registries, to police information, so that they can gather this information, but they have the expertise to bring all the dots together.
Matthew, do you want to...
Look, just on the finance piece, there's some interesting points to be made here in terms of U.S.-European cooperation. So from a U.S. perspective, the financial intelligence units are critically important. I'd say we primarily do not see them as the primary point at which everything goes through. They have a particularly important interface with the private sector. But in the U.S. system, there's a lot more of an intelligence-driven focus by the intelligence agencies and law enforcement to help drive that, to complement it. And I'll give you another example of how this process has gone about, again, from the Terror Finance Tracking Program example. Once the US and the EU came to terms on how to continue to use this program moving forward, the European Union decided to have certain cutouts. And so for a long time, really until the rise of the Islamic State, there was a cutout, and so anybody who sent money within the EU in euro denominations, those financial transactions were cut out from the system. That was a point of US-EU discussion and debate. We very much disagreed with that. Once the Islamic State became a much bigger threat, and let's be blunt, a much bigger threat in Europe, here the EU. And EU institutions actually said, wait a minute, we need to be able to have insight into euro-denominated transactions within the EU that might be financing terrorism, and they closed that gap. So even as we work very closely together, we don't always see eye to eye, but it's the ability to have that ongoing communication in a kind of positive manner that enables us to move the ball forward over time.
There's one, Irfan, would you like to add anything, or I just...
You move on.
There's one like a term that you've brought into the conversation and has become very fashionable, CV, PV. Now everybody's in the CV, PV business. Now everybody's working, like people have CV expert as a title. Which is interesting. I've also been involved in this field for like 15 years, and it's interesting to observe how this changed. Until a few years ago, and I'm talking probably until the Boston bombing, so 2013, interacting with US officials or think tanks and discussing the issue of prevention of radicalization was irrelevant, was not fashionable, and like a European thing. Clearly this has changed because it's become an industry in the US too. How much do you think are any of the two continents behind or ahead in terms of prevention of radicalization?
That's a good question, and I'm actually starting to question my title of having CVE in it, so thank you for that. But when it comes to, no, I think you make a good point, because you're right, it has gone so far in that everyone thinks that any development type of work can be CVE, and I think there's a danger in trying to link very good work, very good development work, or very good work in a community through the lens of counterterrorism, the lens of CVE. So I think CVE, to what Alex was talking about earlier, it's the understanding the grievances, understanding what the local drivers are, and those drivers are in neighborhoods. They're not in countries. They're at a very local level in neighborhoods. So it's that understanding of where the radicalization of violence is happening that I think has really been the forefront of the relationship between Europe and the United States. Initially, we would look at radicalization from a federal level or a global level, and we would look at these global drivers to radicalization of violence. And it wasn't until after 2013, after 2014, really started to learn that it's really at a very localized level. You must be touched at a very local level to continue on the pathway of radicalization of violence. I mean, looking specifically here in Belgium, looking at neighborhoods in Belgium outside of Brussels, where you started to learn, and it was our relationship really with the mayor of Vilvoorde, just not too far from here, that really helped us understand how a small town like Vilvoorde can attract 200 some odd kids to join the fight in Syria and Iraq. That was mind-blowing really, and it opened our thoughts to what we need to do at a very localized level.
Alexander, do you want to comment from a RAN perspective?
Yes, I would just to complement that indeed, I mean, this understanding that the work needs to be done at the local level, that is really very much at the heart of what the EU has been doing in this area to facilitate that work. And that was, Alexander mentioned it before, that when in 2011 the Commission created and supported this radicalization awareness network, which is precisely the idea of bringing those, we call them frontline practitioners, together, exactly those who on the local level, they encounter the problems, they see also opportunities to act, to support them, to give them a forum that they can exchange among each other, that the RAN having 9 working groups, really trying to bring more or less homogeneous groups of practitioners together, be it police officers or prison and probation officers, in the education field, teachers, to give them a forum to exchange where they see the challenges and also to identify best practices. But I would just to add one other layer, while it is indeed the frontline practitioners at local level that need to be supported and they have perhaps primary knowledge, we have now realized after now a number of years that we also need to link support to local actors to the regional and national policy level, because member states, they have their own policy, but they were not so far engaged in the activities of the RAN. So we have started by creating a separate RAN working group for local coordinators. So that was to bring the local policy level in there. But now we also try to bring in much more policymakers from member states and integrate them into the activities of the RAN so that they can also exchange the policy level learning from practitioners directly and not only through high-level events, but also the other way around. So that is now the latest development, so to speak, to bring also the experience and expertise from the local level really back to the policy level and foster a better exchange between the different levels.
That's very interesting. How much to what extent do you believe that an experiment or an initiative like RAN can be replicated in the US? Is it conceivable, or the system is so, both the problems and the systems are so different that it's not realistic?
Well, it's different in the United States, and there are several kind of parallel efforts that bring together various think tanks and government to do this type of thing in the United States. But it's interesting to see how these things play out differently in the US and Europe. You're absolutely right that until the Boston Marathon bombing, the idea of CVE getting a real federal push hadn't gone very far. It's not that there hadn't been efforts, it's that the interagency wasn't able to get itself together. There's a lot of infighting. And with the Boston Marathon, there was the sense of, wait a minute, it's not just a question of people being radicalized in Europe, it's people being radicalized in the United States as well. That was the big difference in that attack. Someone had been radicalized in the United States. There still is a sense that the number of people who are being radicalized in the United States is much smaller. The number of travelers to Syria and Iraq, both people who actually went and those who tried to go and were thwarted or failed, is much, 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 much smaller in the United States. But there are Islamic State-inspired plots in all 50 states, and this is something that has gotten now a lot more attention. At the Washington Institute, we did a big bipartisan study which basically found that, to be perfectly honest, U.S. CVE efforts focused on working with our allies abroad, what Irfan and his colleagues are doing at the State Department, was really quite developed. But U.S. efforts to put in place CVE policies at home was very, very far behind for a variety of legal and cultural and funding issues that we are only now just beginning to overcome. But I think part of it is still this sense of this is a problem that is largely over there. And the way we have dealt with it, to be blunt, especially under the Trump administration, which is much more interested in preventing terrorism than countering violent extremism as such, is by pushing these efforts down to the state and local levels, which is where, as Irfan said, ultimately these activities are happening, and empowering people who are working in cities, in communities, to be able to either prevent people from being radicalized, engage in interventions, to counter those who are on the pathway to radicalization, and to deal with those who might be returning. And in the United States, again, it's not so much a question of returning foreign terrorist fighters. Those numbers are minuscule. But we do now see the first people getting out of prison who were convicted on terrorism and terrorism-related offenses after 9/11, through and including some of the early traveler cases. And so we do have a question of, on the back end, how do you deal with people who were radicalized, went through the prison system, are now being released, and what do we do with them now back in communities?
So if I could add to that, I think the numbers are small, as Matthew noted, but when you look at the ISIS-inspired attacks that have happened in the United States, it did catch a lot of people off guard, that you did have attacks like in Boston. Then it spread to places like Orlando, Chattanooga, Tennessee, places that you would never think an ISIS-inspired attack would happen. And though I think Matt's right that there was a not very good coordination in trying to get a RAND type of network off the ground in the United States, they were able to learn from what's going on around the world globally on how to connect communities, how to connect civil society for CVE purposes. So a few years ago, there was a network that was set up called the Strong Cities Network, which was designed to get the conversation, again, at a very local level, at a mayoral level or a city councilman or woman level. And it was through that where cities like Orlando and Tampa and Los Angeles and New York and Chattanooga could connect with their counterparts here across Europe. And with the Strong Cities Network alone, they have done a series of exchange programs bringing together communities and leaders. And I mentioned Vilvoorde, one of the first city exchanges that took place between the United States, or Europe and the United States, was between Vilvoorde and Columbus, Ohio. And since then, we've seen exchanges between London and Los Angeles, Marseille and Orlando, Madrid and Boston, Arnhem and the Netherlands with Phoenix, Arizona, Dusseldorf and Seattle. So the list goes on with a very, very concrete way of connecting European cities who have a long history of dealing with this, with the United States cities, which have a relatively short history of dealing with this, but a long history of building communities, building community resilience, and building community engagement. I think two of the three things that we will note are part and parcel of a comprehensive CVE approach.
I would like to broaden it a little bit, because we're not only speaking about the Islamic State, right? We talk about right-wing extremism as well, left-wing extremism, separatist extremism, and terrorism. So it's about political violence. It's about ideologies that describe some sort of perfect end state, and that use violence or advocate for violence to get there. And we have to then make sure that by intervening in a social engineering context, so there is a dynamic somewhere, we're trying to intervene often from the top, that we're not increasing the problem. So do no harm should be much more on the agenda, because we are growing, we are getting better organized, we're getting smarter, and the risk of unintended consequences through intervening in a community that is struggling with political violence, ideas, networking, recruiting, grooming, are immense. The risk of stigmatization. If nobody really cared about you and suddenly you get approached by a dozen actors that you should attend a capacity building workshop that will tell you how to be a good citizen, and you get a lot of additional information, and you see yourself or people from your peer group in the news constantly, we really have to be cautious with this. And this also relates to root causes. A long time we thought that poverty and socioeconomic drivers were in the center of this. The research in the last 10 years has highlighted that that is not so much a key driver. It is a driver in the individual case, but you need 5 factors. And one is grievances. You need to be unhappy. There's no such thing as a happy terrorist, right? So you need to be unhappy about the status quo. It could be your personal or that of the group that you associate to, your in-group. And this injustice theme could be subjective or it could be real, doesn't matter. And then you have emotional needs. You're unhappy with your life, you want an upgrade, you want to be important, you want prestige, you want to be a hero, or you want to be the mother of the nation or the mother of the cubs of the Caliphate, an upgrade. So these two things exist in the hundreds of millions on this planet. They cannot be essential. They are necessary, but not sufficient. So what's coming then? And then you have conspiracy theories. We largely ignore that the gap between people having grievances and people that are unhappy to an extremist ideology and a terrorist group is the thinking that there is a conspiracy against them, that there's a hidden hand, usually anti-Semitic elders of Zion narratives on the right, and on the Islamist side, you have the Wall Street capitalism, imperialism, Rothschild narrative that is also somewhat anti-Semitic. And if you have these grievances, you are unhappy, and you believe in these theories why the world is so bad to you, because it's not your fault, of course, that's the narrative, it's always somebody else's fault, then you have an ideology that suddenly makes sense of all of that and says, join us, we are under attack, we are the victims. The ideology legitimizes the use of violence against those who are supposedly attacking you. And they say, if you join us, forget your old life, you get an upgrade, you become a hero, you can be strong, you will be significant. This also is not enough, because ideology is everywhere. We all would be sitting in Raqqa if ideology would be significant, because you all have seen the propaganda of the Islamic State, and nobody here is 100% happy, and you know about conspiracy theories. And then we come to my last point, hotbeds. If you look at the distribution of extremism, there's never an equal distribution of extremism. You have Vilvoorde and you have Mechelen. Between them is a couple of miles. One village has 200 violent extremists, the other one, very few. Why is that? The socioeconomic circumstances are similar, and that's true in Somalia, in Egypt, in Germany, in France, in Great Britain. You have hotbeds, and these hotbeds of radicalization are usually driven by recruiting networks, by real old-school offline networks where people groom youth, promote conspiracy theories, suggest simplistic ideologies, how to fix the world, and then promise this kind of upgrade to their life. So you need these 5 factors: grievances, emotional needs, you need some sort of conspiracy thinking in the play, the ideology that makes sense of all of this, and the recruiting network. And then you have covered 80% around. That's what, there are people who get radicalized in the basement, never talking to anyone. But these are, and they are relevant, But the large numbers of radicalization, if we look at patterns, need these 5 actors and 5 factors. And this also allows for prevention to be more targeted. So instead of saying we need more playgrounds everywhere, look at the radicalization hotbeds. Try to empower local people from these communities and neighborhoods to speak up when somebody raises a conspiracy theory or an ideology that is against our core values and everything. So empowering the local resilience, the local Democrats who want to speak out but might not know exactly how to, might not have a network, might not receive funding because they can't be involved in a 9-month application process to receive government structured grants. This is something I think when we want to break it down is what to do, and always considering the do no harm headline above it.
Alex, thank you. That's very, very interesting, very important perspective, and I have lots of more questions. But before I open to the public for questions, how much of what Alex said resonate with you, with our US colleagues, in terms of interpretation, in terms of, because the idea is that we're talking about cooperation, about sharing also the understanding of the threat and possibly of the solution, at least in terms of approach.
I mean, generally, it's exactly on point with everything that we've learned and everything we're trying to develop programs to address violent extremism. You talk about the grievances, you talk about the drivers, both global and local. You talk about preventive efforts, the conditions conducive to violent extremism, and how first do no harm. And the research has shown in some parts of East Africa and West Africa in particular, where government overreach and government abuse can be that first line of driving someone towards seeking a change. Again, they're not happy, like you said. So I think we're in full agreement in what's getting people there. One point I wanted to really stress is something that you said towards the end, which is, a lot of these are hotbeds or neighborhoods that are driven by offline recruitment. And so often we get into this idea that it's the internet that's the problem. And I want to be very clear here, the internet's not the problem. The internet is not the reason we have people getting radicalized to violence. It certainly helps, it certainly speeds up the process, but it's not the driver. And so when we're trying to leverage the internet for CVE purposes, we have to understand that maybe censorship is not the way to go, number one. Number two, we can use better ideas to kill those bad ideas, and it's empowering those local voices that have greater reach, that have greater resonance, has greater credibility than I ever could. I can put out all the tweets all day long, but who's going to listen to me? So it's a matter.
I'll listen to you.
Okay, thanks, Matt. See, I feel better now. I got 3 followers at least on my Twitter feed now. So that's where it is. It's really understanding how to find those local voices and how to amplify those local voices. But please keep in mind that it's not the internet that we should be countering.
So.
You've just dispelled the myth.
Well, first of all, that's one area of disagreement sometimes in terms of how to deal with the internet piece of it, however large or small it is. And there's not always a confluence of approaches in this between the US and our European partners. Right. It's a small world of thinkers on the CVE issue, so we're all in complete agreement on this theory. There's a disconnect sometimes between some of the academic analysts and policymakers, and we also have to remember within the EU we're dealing with member states, and not everything is the same. So the Italians have a preference for deporting whenever possible people who can be deported elsewhere. They'd much prefer to do that than to have that person in a CVE program. The French have some other issues and have done some CVE things that have worked and some that haven't worked as well. It's not like CVE is, we keep asking, it's across the EU, the US. It's not exactly the same at all within the EU member states. And it's certainly not at all the same within the United States, which we are a federal system. And when you do, as I said earlier, when you push this down policymaking-wise to state and local governments, then they're going to be doing things slightly differently. And one of the things we've found actually is that that's not so bad. After the Boston Marathon bombings, one thing the federal government did is it said, okay, we're gonna have 3 pilot programs in Boston, Minneapolis, and Los Angeles. They did this without consulting those 3 cities. They informed those 3 cities that they were now pilot programs and that federal government would be back in a number of months to judge their success, and they would be asked to do whatever they were going to do without any additional funding. So it was a happy story all around. One of the things positive things that came out of it, though, was that each of those cities developed somewhat different ways of dealing with CVE. Minneapolis had a very different situation than others, with a lot more hotspot radicalization, first to Al-Shabaab and then to Islamic State. LA decided to work this on a very, very local level between the city and LAPD, the LA Police Department. In Boston, the state of Massachusetts decided to work things on a more broad state level, bringing in not federal, but state health and human services, state Homeland Security level agencies, and put in place much more of a kind of public health style model. And finally, the last thing to say is that in all of our countries, we have political systems, and those political systems bring in change. We had that recently in the United States. And so there's political change that is affecting how we see CVE, PVE, or as the Trump administration sometimes likes to call it now, terrorism prevention. And it's not really fair, it's only been about a year of the administration, but we're seeing some changes and some birthing pains here too. Some people, including myself, have been quite critical of the idea of calling it terrorism prevention for some of the reasons you heard. It's kind of stigmatizing to local neighborhoods if you come to them and say, I'm only here to talk to you about terrorism prevention, as opposed to good governance and ways in which we can help things work better in your community. But so I don't want to leave you with the impression that it's this like static flow, either within European member states, within states in the United States, or across time as we have political change within our democracies, to the extent Russia allows that to continue.
Thank you. Let me open
Could
to...
I perhaps just make on 2 of the points that were made here? Because I think in Europe, the approach is not to harmonize. I mean, whatever we do with Iran or elsewhere, it's not that at the end you would have one model. The beauty is indeed to see how different local municipalities, member states have very different approaches. Their CVE strategies have a different focus. They have a different approach. But the beauty is precisely to see these differences and kind of see, for those who have not yet developed something, what can they learn from the different approaches? And there is where we would try to help also through the run in giving guidance. What makes this approach transferable to my context, and what do I need to have in place? So something like, I mean, the famous Aarhus model, would that ever work in Italy, for example? So that is the approach, not one of harmonizing, but really drawing on the differences and see what can work in a particular local context. And then I would just have to make one point on the online radicalization, if you allow me. I think there's always this discussion online. I mean, internet is not radicalizing as such, but I think it's a bit futile to make this argument, because obviously the internet plays an important role in all our lives. I mean, we draw most of our information from the internet. We are very much, and youngsters more than perhaps myself, very much attached, looking for different answers to what Alexander said, the different grievances, and you easily find terrorist propaganda of all kind on the internet. So it's only obvious that this kind of propaganda has an impact on the youth that is seeking answers, or is what you said in terms of injustices. This is fueled by the propaganda. And I think we cannot allow this propaganda to stay on the internet. And we need to protect the users, that they are not exposed to that kind of terrorist propaganda. This is only one part of it. And with the EU Internet Forum, we brought together member states, the industry, the main players, but also smaller companies, Europol, the RAN, to look at what we can do as regards online radicalization. And the Internet Forum has 2 objectives. The one is the takedown. Really, we don't want to have that kind of content on the internet. We need to protect the users against such content. But the other equally important part is to support civil society in developing their alternative or counter narratives, I mean, depending on where you put the focus. And there we have, with the help of the RUN and the industry, that was really a very collaborative approach, developed training programs which were rolled out through all member states in the EU, training 250 civil society organizations. Alexander knows much better because he's very closely involved as the working group leader of RUN Communications and Narrative to precisely support civil society in developing this other voice, because we will never get rid of all terrorist content on the internet. So you need to have the alternative narratives out there to respond to grievances and give another perspective. But I just want to say, I know that there are slight differences in the approach between the EU and the US, but I think we need to recognize that online propaganda has an impact on youth and radicalization. And it's not about what percentage it is, and perhaps it was not the main driver, but to the extent that it is an important factor, we cannot just close our eyes and say, let's help some civil society organizations with 2 or 3 million euros or dollars to develop some alternative narratives. That will not do the trick.
Thank you. Let me try, I'll take 2 or 3 questions, and so we have 1 and 2 and 3. We have them. So if you could please identify yourself. I'm a non-resident fellow with the Sorry, just the microphone doesn't work. Doesn't seem to work. Can I ask the microphone? Yeah, so my first question is for Alexander. You spoke about the factors, the common denominator, but you didn't mention. My second question is to Matt. In terms, I want to look at big data analytics and the propensity, what it shows, what it can indicate in terms of people who are going to join, who have a propensity to join terrorist organizations. What are the behavioral markers that you see that are common to these people? I'm talking about behavior, not just in terms of ideology. And are these behavioral markers applied as well to Europe and to the United States? Are they common to the two regions? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Mehmet Aşçı from trainee from Committee of the Regions. My question is about the financing terrorism. In 2015, ex-Prime Minister of UK, David Cameron, delivered a speech in Singapore, and he said he's not going to let the global dirty money to be laundered in the UK property market, particularly in London. And 3 years later, a member of parliament, Margaret Hodge, has written an article on The Guardian after the Salisbury events. And she also said, if we want to stop Putin, and we have to stop Russian kleptocrats to stop laundering money in the UK property market as well. So 3 years have passed. There is no progress in the UK, apparently. But I didn't notice any single complaint from any continental European politicians about money laundering in the property market. So my question is, do you think there is no problem? There is no money laundering in the property market by the terrorist organizations? Or there is, but it is not significant and it is not relevant to terrorist organizations? Or I'm afraid the third case is not true, but European politicians are not aware of this problem. Or any other explanation from the panelists? Thanks.
Thank you. Then we had a third question here and a fourth here, and then I will stop.
Hello, my name is Agata Sviatkiewicz. I'm from the European External Action Service, and my question is rather for Alexandra and Alexander, because it's focused on Europe. And so, looking into root causes and the consequences of countering terrorism and radicalization, how would you correlate the ongoing securitization of migration in Europe and the rise of terrorism in Europe? I mean, would you say there is an causability or consequential relation between the two?
And last question.
Hello, my name is Emily von Sydow. I'm a Swedish journalist. Let's go to the good examples, the Mechelen. Why has it succeeded? And what can Europe and maybe US, I don't know, do to sustain that success?
Thank you. So there's quite a few questions to Alex and Alexandra. Let's start with the question about the Caliphate, the first questions. And
all right, so that I try to include this in the topic of ideology, right? So grievances, emotional needs, conspiracy theories, ideology, and recruiting. So in the ideology of explains the world. The past, the present, and the future. Extremist ideologies start with a victim narrative that says we are under attack and we need to defend ourselves. And this is the victimhood narrative as a starter. Then there's a solution. And the solution is, for example, the Caliphate for some people with an Islamist ideology backing that, or a Führer state for right-wing extremists, or a workers' paradise for left-wingers, whatever. And this state is supposed to provide everything you need, so you can project all your emotional and other needs into this utopia. And this is a key factor in a process. However, again, a lot of people have needs, but very few radicalize. The key question that we're often missing is not so much why do so many people radicalize, but why do so few people radicalize. So what is the organic resilience in communities that struggle with violence, that struggle with all kinds of socioeconomic deprivation, with all kinds of issues? What are the narratives, the structures that keep people together looking for other solutions, for alternative narratives, for alternative ways of action? Because you can't simply say to someone who's very upset, let's say about killings of Sunni Muslims in Syria, if your response is don't do anything, you're not going to go, this is not a solution. You have to offer alternative paths of action, and they're more credible, as Irfan said, if they come from the community. This is one of the insights, I think, regarding the ideology that needs to be addressed, and preferably from the peer group, meaning from your friends and families, from your teachers and coaches, from your neighbors. It's much more effective than a guy like me coming into any community and educating people about what the real world is about. But I like to do that, but it's not very effective. I think. There are more effective ways.
I'll stay with you, and we won't answer the questions in order. But you mentioned the other question was on root causes, and particularly whether migration flows and terrorism are somehow connected.
Right. Well, there might be individual connections, obviously. The Islamic State has put in fake refugees and sent them to Europe under the status of refugees to have the discussion that we then had that refugees are terrorists. So this is, again, the strategic level, how to instigate fear, polarization, how to divide societies. And the big strategy behind that is to divide, to get rid of the gray area of those citizens who don't really see themselves as active Democrats in liberal democracies and those who are extremists. In between, there's a lot of people. So by pushing people to the corner, if everybody, there's an interesting thing called fear your neighbor. This is one of the strategies, right? Management of savagery is one of these interesting strategic documents you can look up on the web. Where Islamists explain their strategy to foster polarization in Western societies so that Muslims feel more excluded and then listen more to the victimhood narrative of extremists. So if you're part of a society and you feel you're part of this, you're kind of immune towards victimhood narratives. If you feel like a victim for whatever reasons and you're being pushed in this direction, you are more open to this kind of thinking. I work with Syrian refugees. I direct a project that focuses on the value discourse in the aspect of integration. Just want to highlight this, that we often misunderstand integration as focusing on language and jobs, which are both very important. But people coming from a different cultural background, religion, tradition, whatever it is, we should offer a process where they can reflect on the backpack that they bring. And this is very much appreciated. So it's not about Germans telling Syrians to be a good German, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This happens in other places. But it's about creating a safe space where people that realize that some of the things that they thought were great are not working here, and that there's room to discuss this openly. Value discourse within Syrians, this is just my project that I'm telling you about, is one way to approach this, and then the participants of these trainings go back in their communities and start their own discussions about how do we want to live together? How can we bring together cultural traditions from the homeland with traditions here in Europe? And this is something also we're not addressing enough. There's a risk also of stigmatization. It is a tricky issue, and that's why it's driven by refugees. The trainers are refugees. The participants are refugees, and we're just creating the platform.
Would you like to add on this point of refugees and terrorists, if there's any correlation? Is there anything else?
I think for me it'd be easiest to just give an answer on a bunch of these questions all at once, if I may. So on the Caliphate issue, I would just say, completely I agree, but I would put this both in the ideology and in the empowerment boxes. Over the past few years, I've been spending a decent amount of time here in Brussels and Molenbeek. And some authorities there like to use the term, as they see over and over again, people whose lives aren't going so well. They're not particularly driven by the ideology. They're certainly not religious. They're not praying once, let alone 5 times a day. But they're given the opportunity to go, as this friend of mine here in Brussels puts it, from zero to hero. And for some, this caliphate, the opportunity to get in on the ground level and help build up the new caliphate, just like the original followers of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was really empowering. And so if you look at a lot of the Islamic State material online, there was plenty of the beheadings and other stuff, but actually a majority of the stuff targeting the West was more positive in nature, talking about the utopia and how you could found a spouse. And if you got a spouse, the Islamic State would pay for your wedding, and pictures of people walking down the riverbank in Raqqa with ice cream cones. And so there's something to be thinking about there too, that people whose lives are so unfulfilling and not working for them don't have alternative narratives to latch onto. Why is this the loudest narrative that has the most traction? That's a problem in our societies. And I'd argue that it has less to do with terrorism or counterterrorism and more to do with good governance and a public health model about how to build societies, which I will also admit to you that in the current American context is an uphill battle, because in the American context, CVE is very much driven from a counterterrorism perspective, which I don't think is healthy. On the big data question, I'm going to punt on that. I actually am not a believer that big data, at least as it is, can give us predictable descriptors of who's going to be a terrorist. I've worked on this for many, many years now, in and out of government, and we are all individuals. And if we were to go during lunch right now out here to a salad bar and all we got was a plate, and every single one of us is going to the same salad bar, each and every one of us would have a slightly different salad. And so the things that are going to drive us are going to be slightly different based on our circumstance. I'm just not a believer that big data can necessarily fix this. The fix is keeping CVE in the counterterrorism world and PVE, preventive, in the good governance world, and having them work in parallel together. That's a hard mix. That's a hard thing to do from a public policy perspective. I do think that this idea of organic resilience is really important. I host a CVE working group at our think tank. We recently hosted a criminologist, and she's done some really brilliant work. And one of the things she said is, look, most criminologists are looking and seeing what's wrong in a community. And she did this study that was looking at this idea of organic resilience, right? Look at one of these hotspots, and actually, even when there's a lot of stuff happening in this one place, the vast majority of people are not involved in this. What is going on here? That even in a place where lots is going wrong, more is going right. And how can you leverage that to affect things in that local neighborhood? And I think that's critically important. And on the property market question, I think you're just asking the question wrong. UK authorities are actually very, very, very advanced in their AML CFT investigations, anti-money laundering and counter-terror financing investigations, both within the serious organized crime units and within the National Terror Finance Investigation units. I haven't seen evidence of markets being a serious source of terror financing. We certainly have seen plenty of money laundering issues going on there, and it does get into a little bit of a political context. When there's enough money invested, it becomes uncomfortable. But I actually give the UK a lot of credit for actually being good leaders in this space. And one of the things we need to be constantly doing in counterterrorism at large, but I would argue specifically in counterterror finance, is looking at how things change. So we take actions on a particular set of issues, and adversaries, terrorists or other illicit actors, are not going to simply stop. There's too many ways to raise money illicitly and illicitly, and we need to adapt. There's a lot of learning and adaptation. So, for example, right after 9/11, the international community took a lot of time and effort to address abuse of charity as a key source of terror financing. And for quite a few years, I think we really nipped that in the bud, and you didn't see it. And then suddenly it popped up over the past few years as a serious issue again. Not quite the same way, not these massive international charities with offices all over the place, but small charities primarily focused on Syria and Iraq. And the reason for this is quite logical. When a catastrophe happens, man-made or natural, and the international community, say the United Nations, appropriately says member states should do all they can to facilitate charitable giving in the context of Syria. If I'm an illicit actor, I see a great vulnerability there. And so it shouldn't surprise that this came up again, nor should it surprise that it wasn't the same exact type of abuse of charity that we saw then. And so we're constantly having to not only address today's problem, but kind of look around the corner and see how our adversaries are going to adapt to deal with that tomorrow.
I'd like to add just two quick things. First, when it comes to this idea of victimhood, and its relation to the idea of the Caliphate, it's no accident that they're so connected. And I think you talked about these ideas of grievances, that your space where you are is not good, and will only get better if you leave and travel to a so-called Caliphate that is set up now in the Middle East, or was set up in the Middle East. And Matthew noted very importantly that when you have this type of narrative and you have this type of messaging that's coming out, yes, we focused on the beheadings, we focused on the very violent stuff, but the stuff that really resonated, that we learned, was the positive stuff. The butcher here does not overcharge you, and there are rules and regulations. And if you look at the very early on messaging that ISIS had, it wasn't violent. It was, come join us as a doctor, as a nurse, as a physician. Let's help build something. And so you connect this idea of you're being victimized where you are, but if you come here, you won't be. That was a very strong draw. And to counter that draw, we still have to focus on this idea of why do people still believe that they are victims where they are? And go back to that idea of conditions conducive. Second, I want to just touch on this idea of how organized crime and money laundering can play a very strong role in terrorism. And I think in the earlier session, it was talked about we have a new national security strategy, and we're drafting a new national CT strategy. And each one of these strategies is touching upon this link. And one of the things that our office and our bureau has done is really increase the efforts to deny safe havens, to deny the opportunities that terrorists have to, use charities, abuse charities, to raise funds, because we all know they need money to operate. And so what we're doing is we have this process through the State Department and through the Treasury Department to formally designate groups so that it gives us leverage to prosecute them under international law and under United States law, under the Material Support for Terrorism law. So as these groups decide to leverage organized crime, how to leverage money laundering and terrorism finance, we can find ways to counter that and deny that safe haven.
Just perhaps a few additional points. I think I can subscribe to a lot of what has been said in reply, and I think it's really important to keep in mind what was mentioned, that it is a really societal challenge, not to focus on it only from a security perspective, and also to strengthen the, what do we call, the protective factors, the resilience. I mean, when we come back to the online environment, indeed, not only take down or counter narratives, alternative narratives, but also enhance media literacies of youngsters. So it is all, I mean, a huge package, and I think perhaps it's because of the numbers, but I think in Europe it is a societal challenge which requires a societal answer. And then perhaps on one point, which was one question on this risk assessment, or how you can find out whether somebody is radicalized and will carry out an attack. Indeed, I think there are so many risk assessments or tools in place, and I think the effectiveness is relatively limited. So, I mean, if you want to scan the whole of the population to find out who will carry out an attack and who is susceptible to doing so, but I think it's not a lost cause. I mean, for example, you need to make aware certain professions. I mean, a health worker or psychologist, because he can see first signs, and it is still valuable to work on such signs and then foresee how that person can have somewhere to call to get a better understanding, or that there will be some kind of follow-up. And then in particular environments, you can still develop risk assessment tools which probably will yield better results. So for example, in prison, we have quite a number of EU-funded projects that focus on how to kind of detect radicalization in the prison environment. And the more focused you have your risk assessment tools, the better the chances are that you may indeed detect the one that you need to detect. And on the money laundering, just an addition, I think what you mentioned, it's important to see the developments. And this is why also within the FAT you have these risk assessments based on a national basis, but also in the European Anti-Money Laundering Directive, you have this supranational risk assessment, which is precisely there to see developments, where are the vulnerabilities and what should be the mitigating measures that should be taken.
Thank you. We have 13 minutes for another round of questions. 1 and 2 and 3. On the Mechelen, the question was directed, I guess, more to our European friends. Yeah.
We collect, or should I?
No, that was
okay,
from the first round.
So there are different narratives. So there were recruitment networks of Sharia for Belgium, for example. There's a Sakani network. There are offline preachers. Offline, right? It's funny to say that. It is also funny that we talked about migration, we're all immigrants. Everyone here in the room is an immigrant, and I don't mean that in a philosophical way, but a digital immigrant. We're encountering a new generation that is our digital natives, that if you talk to people under 15, often youth, they say there's no difference between online and offline. This is also something we need to catch up on, and it will be us that have to catch up. We cannot probably invest too much in explaining people that there was a time when there was a difference between online and offline. So the narrative is that Mechelen was more aggressive towards these recruitment networks and kicked them out, basically. That's what I heard. I couldn't verify this. So there's propaganda, there are conspiracy theories, there's a gap in between, and this is usually filled by a credible messenger. So if your uncle, your friend, your brother, your neighbor, or someone with a respectable a background for you, a charismatic preacher, makes sense of all these narratives, then the likelihood that you adopt this ideology increases. It's not a necessary result, but it increases. So intervening early on these recruiting networks is key, but it is tricky because the grooming is legal. Spreading ideas, gathering in public, religious freedom, political, exchange. The gap between grooming, talking about ideas, and recruiting for conflict is where the government is very limited. And this is where civil society, the local communities can step in and fill that with alternative narratives and alternative courses of actions. Narratives is one thing, the other is what can I do? Who can I write a letter to? How can I organize a march? Who do I donate my money to? So it's not an NGO that actually has a weird background, right? Giving practical things to people that want to do something is half of the important task that we've not been doing very well so far.
So I go back to one question.
Yes, Gregor Christian Smile from the European Bishops' Conference. So I've got a question recognizing the important role of religious actors in local communities. Which role for them in CVE efforts? Which positive, which also maybe negative role? Thank you very much.
And then we had a second question here, please.
Yeah, Henrike Kruse from the representation of Lower Saxony to the EU. In my question, I would like to maybe focus on right-wing extremism because, attacks in Europe, both in Europe and in the US, show that it's a very prevalent threat. I would be especially interested to the situation in the US. If there is like a specific approach to prevent right-wing extremism, if there is a link to maybe programs against Islamism, and if maybe it's a problem that right-wing attacks are less likely to be framed as terror actually than maybe Islamist attacks. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have 10 minutes now. I would like to start with a round of answer. We start from this side now.
From this side?
From the American side.
All right. Look, I think religious actors have a very important role to play in CVE, and not necessarily in the ways you might think. That is to say that when you are dealing with cases of Islamist extremism, and particularly those cases where people are truly latching onto an ideology, then you do have a need for religious experts who are versed in religious texts to be able to have that conversation in a way that someone like I cannot or is not as credible an actor to do that. But I would argue that there are many more important ways. You know, we've been discussing here for some time now how you have individuals within communities who don't feel they belong, who feel marginalized, let's be blunter, who feel they are experiencing racism. There is an important role to play for religious leaders of different faiths in helping people feel that they are part of a larger community. Interfaith dialogue, not just for the purpose of exchanging ideas about one another's faith, but about feeling like you are overall part of a community, to push back on feelings, for example, of Islamophobia, that maybe leaders of other faiths don't feel comfortable talking to you. I think it's not just a question of religion, and therefore it's not just a question of religious leaders, but I also think the religious leaders have an important role to play on things that are not specifically religious, but just as community leaders in helping to make their communities be more inclusive. I would argue in some ways that non-religious role for community leaders, in this case of a religious nature, is extremely important. Right-wing extremism. This is a little bit of a third rail in the United States right now. It's a sensitive topic. I argue it shouldn't be, but it is. There are some who see right-wing extremism as something different than international terrorism. And in that, they're right. Right-wing extremism in the United States tends to be of a domestic nature, right? But I think it's wrong for people to make a distinction between domestic terrorism and international terrorism, and really by default trying to make a distinction between extremism and terrorism. If you're carrying out an act of violence to try and effect a political change, targeting civilians, bottom line, it's terrorism. And I think that we really need to be able to wrap our heads around that. That ends up being a much bigger political discussion in the United States, especially in our political context right now. What you are seeing, again, within communities, within local communities and states, the people who are putting together CVE programs, by and large, that are successful, they are not limiting themselves to any one ideology. And the reason, as Alexandra and Alexander both have suggested, is that at the end of the day, and as I said, it's about good governance, it's about a public health model. So if you have people in schools, and you have clinical social workers, and you have librarians, and you have coaches who are paying attention to what's going on in their community, not looking at big data for who's going to be Al-Qaeda, but looking at small data. Who seems to not be doing well in school because of a divorce, because they just moved to community, whatever it is, and seems at risk of whatever, Islamic State, gangs, drugs, whatever it is, dropping out of school, that's where we will have, and I would argue this is very PVE, preventive, not countering violent extremism, which is later on, can be very, very effective. PVE is going to focus on a community, on a geographic location, on a community. CVE is going to focus farther on in the process on an individual who's already going down a path. And I think that those programs that have been most successful in the United States are those that end up dealing with right-wing extremism and left-wing extremism and religious extremism of different types of natures, not just Al-Qaeda or Islamic State or Islamism in general. And they're effective because it's the same tools. At the end of the day, if someone is truly drawn to Islamist ideology, you'll also bring in some Muslim religious experts to explain that maybe there is not a sixth pillar of jihad. Right? And for someone who's going down a different path of right-wing extremism that maybe has some type of right-wing religious ideology, you'll bring in someone else. Or maybe there'll be no ideological component. To be most effective, we have to be on the ground, in communities, and ultimately, if we're doing this early, we'll be looking for any type of extremism, not just religious extremism.
Very quickly, one of the things Matt talked about earlier was this rise of violent extremism in a city called Minneapolis, where you had 30-some-odd kids disappear overnight to go join Al-Shabaab. There was some research done in that locality, in that area, to determine why 30 kids went. And what was found was that these groups, these recruiters, were targeting hundreds of kids. So if you look at the numbers, that 30 went was actually kind of low. And so they asked those individuals that were recruited but didn't go, what made you stay? What made you push back against that recruitment? And they said, my understanding of the religion. They knew that some of the things that were being taught to them or told to them was misinformation or disinformation. So when you ask about the role of religious actors, it is not a panacea because, as Matt also rightly noted, this is not a religious doctrine per se, but there's a very important role that they can play in pushing back on that specific misinformation and disinformation, specifically around the concept of the misunderstanding of jihad. When it comes to the right-wing extremist issue, there are some things we're actually learning. How they use things like gang recruitment and how they affect children using narratives that are more relevant to them, using online. Again, I take your point, online, offline. I feel old just saying it, but yeah, you're right. My 14-year-old will never look up from her phone. Every interaction is through that phone. And so we have to understand how right-wing extremists understand that very, very clearly, and they're using narratives. We can understand how to push back on that. So it is a third rail. It's a very difficult topic to have right now, but I think there are similarities. Just like Germany has learned from Exit Germany into the Hayat program, there are similarities we can use.
Alexandra.
Yeah, just I think most of what my colleagues said, I think I can subscribe to that. I think indeed, I mean, with the right-wing extremism, the problem we face in perception is perhaps that indeed it is very often not prosecuted as a terrorist crime. I mean, you have a similar problem when you have hate crimes, which may be prosecuted as normal crimes. So there is something in there that when it comes to prosecution, a lot of these right-wing extremist acts are not qualified, and you find perhaps 1 out of 100 of cases where you have then a prosecution under terrorist crimes. And I don't want to say that that determines the overall perception, but it may be part of an explanation why sometimes right-wing extremism is kind of an extremism, since it doesn't have the word terrorism, is kind of perceived as something of a lesser importance, if in reality it is not. But indeed, it is not part of an international a terrorist organization recruiting on that global scale. So indeed, the impact, and also in terms of numbers of casualties. I mean, there are still quite a number of differences, but I think it's important to not lose it from the radar just because it is kind of belittled as right-wing extremism. And then on the religious actors, I think indeed it is an area where we have to explore much more how to engage with them. And Alexander, I mean, from the experience with the RUN has looked into various angles, and it is not always obvious, because you could say, should we promote kind of more moderate Islamic interpretations and support those religious leaders who have a more moderate voice? But then the question is, perhaps they reach some, they are in their community, it's all fine, but do they really reach the target audience who are precisely not interested in religion as such, but just find an ideology which helps them justify violence and get them to action? So perhaps even if we would promote more moderate religious leaders, would they really reach the target audience? But it does not mean that we should not try or engage with them, but it is not always obvious. The same, for example, in prisons. Can you say, okay, I have religious counseling in prison, and they are a number of instances where this is adequate, but not in all instances. You would have to decide whether in a particular context you rather try get your foot in the door through another means and not start, addressing all kind of religious concepts, but rather think about, after you get out of prison, where can I help you in finding a job and so forth. So it is these religious actors and engagement with them is very important, but we have to see precisely where they could be of use depending on the circumstances, and perhaps not to kind of think that if we will support moderate religious leaders overall, we tackle the problem, that's it. So I think it requires very nuanced responses.
3 quick things. In development cooperation, also at the beginning of CVE, we had the model of throwing good things at people and hoping that something would stick, right? It was not necessarily based off an in-depth understanding of local drivers and also local factors of resilience. We just thought if we push governance, if we do infrastructure, more playgrounds, more social work, more whatever, we might have an impact. We have moved towards coming up with detailed theories of change, where you have to go to the painful process of making the case that your designed intervention, based on a prior assessment, will have the intended effect because of, for example, religious authorities. If the lack of religious knowledge is a factor in this very specific local radicalization process, then bringing in well-meaning religious authorities might be a good idea. If that's not the case, probably not. You always have limited resources, limited time. Focus yourself on the key drivers, which you first have to understand, and then come up with a theory of change and pick out of the tool set, for example, the RAND tool set, the things that apply for your local context. Second thing, racism, grievances. If 99% of people that struggle with the world, 99.9% don't radicalize, I hesitate in declaring that this is a key issue. Most people who face racism don't become extremists. If we look at the German case of right-wing extremism, where we have hotbeds in different states of Germany, for example, in Saxony, Sächsische Schweiz, that's a very beautiful area, and parts of that region have been supporting right-wing extremist parties for a long, long time, and it's the middle class. Good luck finding objective factors of discrimination for those people. It is more about a feeling of humiliation, and people react to feelings in different ways. So if, again, we have limited resources and time, I'm not sure if focusing on these grievances that are very broad and where everybody reacts differently is the key. We have to fight racism, of course, but not necessarily with the PVE budget, right? There are different packages for different problems. And the last point, internet was mentioned. Propaganda is a key issue from the perspective of the extremists. They invest a lot of money and time in pushing out the message. We have to make sure we don't push it further, introducing extremist propaganda to everyone, telling every young person that we're scared to death of the Islamic State. A lot of people will only start looking into this because they realize that we're very, very afraid. So let's also reconsider our approach. And the worst of the worst, the videos that are illegal and that promote violence and that show violence need to be taken off social media. And there's technology for this, and this is an achievement of the EU Internet Forum, that the social media companies, who are different things, but mostly advertising companies, have changed their priority and have now invested in algorithms and staff to make sure that the extremist propaganda is less visible, the worst of the worst. We're not talking about free speech here. We're talking about beheadings and calls for killing of Jews and all these things. And there are algorithms by NGOs like eGlyph from the Counter-terrorism project and others who provide solutions to fight this. This is a niche of the propaganda, but it's the worst of the worst, and we need to focus on this more and have better technical solutions.
Thank you. Yes, we're stopping. I'm very sad because I have many more questions on a personal level. And I think we just open, as it often happens with these panels, we just open a potential for this debate. I would like to thank the EPC for inviting me to moderate this very interesting session, and of course the US mission to the EU for supporting this whole conference. And of course, thank you all for making this such a very interesting and lively discussion.
And to you for moderating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we've pretty much solved everything.
I'm out of a job now.
I think we're okay. I think, by the way, wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be nice?